Hello, this is Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB, and I'm joined by our Chair, Emmanuel Faber, recording this podcast following our February meeting here in Montreal. So this week we've not only had our board meeting, we've been busy, and we've also had an in-person meeting of our jurisdictional working group, a meeting of the Canadian Coalition that sponsored the opening of our office here in Montreal, a meeting of the IFRS and Sustainability Alliance, and tomorrow we'll have our inaugural IFRS Sustainability Symposium, where we're welcoming around 500 people in person in Montreal, with a further 500 joining us online. So it's been a landmark board meeting this week, with the ISSB taking the final decisions around the technical content and voting to move to the balloting process ahead of issuing our first two standards towards the end of the second quarter this year. But before we talk about what this balloting process looks like and what happens between now and when those standards are issued, Emmanuel, maybe let's talk through the rationale for the final decisions that the board took this week. And one of the things we talked about today was the reference to GRI and the European standards. And I wondered if you could explain how we decided to do that and why.
Sure, thank you, Sue. So how we decided, those sources of guidance to identify metrics in the absence of an ISSB standard to meet investor information needs, GRI and the European standards will be added to the sources of guidance via an appendix as standards that companies may consider, in other words, are allowed to consider. Why have we done that is a matter that we've actually started to discuss early November and had stored until our last discussions this week. We are doing this because our standards allow companies, when we do not have an ISSB standard that they identify as being as accurate or as useful as possible for them to discuss financial matters with their investors. We provide today that they can use any standard setter product that is designed for the investor focus that we have. And we've decided to open two exceptions to that. One is GRI and the other one is ESRS. GRI because we signed an MOU with them nearly a year ago already now. They've been in the reporting space for 25 years. A large number of companies are using GRI now. They are addressing a broader stakeholder group than we are. And we believe that because of the number of companies using them, we would simplify their life and reducing the cost of reporting for those companies that choose or have to report on a multi-stakeholder basis if we were going to coordinate our work and cooperate with GRI to ensure that ISSB standards plus GRI standards can create a seamless suite of solutions for those companies, with GRI focusing on the multi-stakeholder approach and we focus on the investor-focused approach. And so because of that, we felt that this could warrant the presence of GRI as an exception to the fact that only investor-focused standard setting references would be allowed. So that's the first one when it comes to GRI. When it comes to the ESRS, we have been working on the interoperability with the ESRS for already several months and making good progress since the back end of the feedback that we received from our consultation. Leveraging that consultation and the feedback together with work we did jointly with EFRAG and now with the EU Commission to come to, I think, a place where we are very confident to deliver maximum interoperability, in particular with S2 on climate, in a delay or with a timeline that will not delay the publication and finalization of our standards So we are at a place where we felt as well that the ESRS existing as they were before we were there, but with this interoperability framework that we're developing, could also be a useful source of information, despite not being specifically investor focused, for companies that are looking for metrics for matters that they believe are financially material in the sustainability space for their investors. So these are the two reasons, complementary reasons, but I think consistent reasons why we introduced them as part of our appendix in S1. So that was our first discussion, and we then discussed the effective date. And Sue, I'd love that you tell us a bit more about the decision on this particular front.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So firstly, what is an effective date? So it's the date when a company who's asserting compliance with our standards would have to apply the standard. And it's a little bit more complicated here because, of course, jurisdictions also are going to make decisions about when the standards are applicable. But from our perspective, when we talk about the effective date, we've decided that it's appropriate for companies to be applying our standards for annual reporting periods beginning on or after the 1st of January 2024. And that's because of the really strong investor demand for this information to be provided on a timely basis, the strong regulatory demand, and also just the general need for comparable and consistent high-quality information about sustainability risks and opportunities, particularly in the case of climate. This is quite a, some people might look at this and think, wow, they're going to publish these standards, in June, and then they're applicable from the 1st of January 2024. That seems quite fast. And that obviously was something we talked about and considered really carefully. But I think there's some really important reasons for why we thought that was still an appropriate decision to make. And that's for a few different reasons. So firstly, S1 and S2 haven't come from nowhere. They've been built on well-established standards and frameworks that people are already familiar with and applying, such as the TCFD recommendations and the ISSB standards. So that provides a head start for many. We've also built in reliefs and guidance to help people start off the application of these standards, and we're going to work on capacity building. So it's probably worth reminding listeners of what some of those reliefs are, and in fact today we confirmed how long some of these reliefs would be around for, so it's worth touching on that as well. So one of the important reliefs is the requirement to provide the sustainability information at the same time as the financial statements. We know it may take companies a little while to get ready to do that on that timeline. So we've said in the first year that you can choose to delay your sustainability report essentially to align with your half-year reporting. The second relief we've provided for the first year is the provision of Scope 3 information. You don't have to do that in the first year that you apply our climate standard. We also will allow companies who are using a different way of measuring Scope 1, 2 and 3 greenhouse gas emissions at the time of starting to use our standards to continue to use that different measurement method for the first year before they migrate to using the GHG protocol. And in the first year you don't have to provide comparative information. So that's all 1-year reliefs. And in addition to that, I think it's also really important to note that when it comes to the measurement of Scope 1, 2 and 3 GHG emissions, we have developed a measurement framework that really allows companies to use estimation and techniques that will enable people to have a little bit of a softer start, which is a dangerous word to use for me, but a softer start to how you do that measurement. And over time, we would expect people to become more sophisticated in their approach. And so that package of reliefs we thought helped people get started and meant that a 2024 date was an appropriate one. So Emmanuel, in the context of all of this, I've been talking about some of the reliefs, but it's a good point maybe to sort of reflect back on some of the other broader conversations we've had about sort of proportionality over time, because that context is also really important to this decision about when people start to use these standards.
Yes, thank you, Sue. I would certainly echo what you've just said about the soft start. I certainly understand what you mean when you say it's a dangerous word for us to use. And in the very same time, I think there is a broad recognition around the table of the board that what we're developing here is a new language. And we are not going to learn that language altogether if we don't start the experience of speaking that language. So we know that preparers, users, regulators, auditors, ourselves are not going to be right in using that language from day one. But the only way that we one day will be right is to start as early as possible. And I think that there was a lot of attention paid literally from the very inception of the board even composition, with our second vice chair being appointed specifically on the topic of capacity building for smaller and medium-sized enterprises, for developing and emerging countries, because we recognize that on sustainability topics, we have to develop a truly inclusive global baseline. So I insist on that because that was even in the governance itself of the ISSB that we've decided to focus on that topic beyond the pure standard setting aspect. Then on the content of the standard setting, we've been regularly in October, November, December, and certainly January, focused on those scalability, proportionality reliefs that we brought to as an answer to the feedback that was given about how big the step might be for smaller companies or beginners in learning that language. I think some of the critical ones were the use of the notion of reasonable and supportable information available without undue costs and effort, which is drawn from the IFRS accounting experience, which we've decided to apply in the identification of the value chains in S1, but also in S2 about the climate scenario analysis, as well as the Scope 3 measurement. In those topics, for instance, we also, I think, very usefully introduced guidance that is based on TCFD. In particular, when it comes to climate scenario analysis, we're saying that just using what TCFD says, you are a beginner, and then you are on the way, and then you are advanced practitioner. And so as a preparer, we are saying you should use a methodology that is commensurate with how and where you operate, depending on how much exposed you think you are to climate risk and what are your skills and capabilities at the very moment. So there is a trajectory of progress over a timeline, but certainly making sure that anyone can start, basically. The same applies with Scope 3, where I think we've provided significant granular guidance as to how preparers should favor primary data versus secondary data, verified versus unverified, yet saying that if you only have secondary data, if you only have non-verified, you still use them because they are useful information for investors. So that has, I think, overall is creating an environment where we believe that the reliefs that were attached to the effective date of 2024 are granularly present in various parts of our standards where we felt they were important to be. And I would say that I found personally very useful the first paper that was attached to the February meeting agenda, which was a summary of all of those proportionality and scalability reliefs and supports and guidance that we have created mainly through the January discussion, but also what had happened before. So with these two aspects of the sources of guidance and the effective date, we came to the view that that was it. That was it for S1 and for S2 after what has been an incredible year of work. And we turn to the next stage. Can you tell us more about this?
So big moment after those decisions, which was the official sort of review of our due process steps, and then the official question that we always have to ask the board at the IFRS Foundation when we're doing our standard setting: do you agree that we have done enough to move to finalising the standard? And do you give the staff permission to move to the balloting process? And the answer was a big, happy, unanimous yes, we do. So we're now moving on to balloting. So what is balloting? So balloting is a very formal process that's described using that term in our due process handbook. And it's a process where we take the decisions that the board has made and we draft the documents, the final standards. It's a drafting process, it's a review process, and it's called balloting because the board members are asked to formally approve and okay that yes, they're happy to publish this document in their name. And this is a really thorough editorial process to make sure that we're clear in our drafting and articulation and that we've accurately reflected what the board intended. So it takes some time, which is why we finished our decision making today, and we expect to publish around June this year. So our editorial, translations and digital reporting teams all get involved in this process to make sure that the document is understandable, that it can be translated into other languages, and that it is clear enough to facilitate and enable digital reporting of the information. And we include some external stakeholders who help us with some of the editorial review processes as well. So it's a very thorough process. So that will be keeping us busy. You may not see much of us at the board table for a while, but it's not because we're relaxing with our feet up. The other thing that we are now starting to really look forward to and thinking about is our capacity building. So really making sure that we are working ourselves and with our partners through our platform arrangements to make sure that the system's ready for application of our standards. And that's truly a global initiative. Even sophisticated companies and developed economies are going to need some help because it's a new type of reporting, and then there will be others in other parts of the world, emerging markets, smaller companies that probably even need more help. But everybody, I think, needs some level of help, and we're really going to be putting a lot of thought and energy into developing materials and working with partners to deliver a core capacity building program across different economic settings around the world. So you'll start to see us, I think, being busy doing that as well. So lots moving into sort of a different part of our business now. Sort of us a lot at the board table. Now we move on to drafting and to capacity building. So Emmanuel, perhaps it's interesting now to talk a little bit about what we're going to be up to between now and our next board meeting in March.
Sure, thanks, Sue. So the first thing, as you alluded to, is we're super happy and proud to host our inaugural IFRS Sustainability Symposium here in Montreal. As you said, welcoming more than 1,000 people overall. I understand more than 40 different countries being represented around this. And we really see this as an incredibly timely event as we have now finalized completely S1 and S2. We were told through the consultation of the trustees of the foundation in 2020 and 2021 that we needed to be climate first, but not climate only. We have now finished the deliberation about climate and many other things, by the way. So that sustainability symposium will also open on the next parts of our agenda that we have already started to share back in Montreal again in December, going into some more pixels on climate, about biodiversity, natural ecosystems, the social and human capital consequences of the climate transition and the resilience plans by companies, and a number of other important things like the ISSB internationalization of their standards, connectivity topics with our brother board, ISSB. So all of that is happening in parallel of the mainstream work of finalizing S1 and S2. We will also consult later on this first half of the year about our future agenda. But immediately thereafter, we will be soon in Tokyo with the foundation trustees, engaging with our colleagues of the Japan FSA, who host an international conference on sustainability disclosure. We're excited about the announcement in Japan that the ISSB has started their work with an exposure draft in 1 year from now, which will incorporate S1 and S2 with a view that the first standards would be issued in 25 in Japan. So that's going to be exciting, and that doubles as well the fact that the G7 presidency of Japan has elected human capital as one of their important topics, and we're happy to cooperate with them in making that happen, as human capital will undoubtedly sooner or later be part of our agenda as well. You alluded to our March meeting and mentioned that our listeners may not see us at the table. Well, maybe we'll be our feet up during this meeting. It's a virtual meeting, but that's because we are going to spend a lot of time now very, very carefully reading the ballot versions of S1, of S2, the effect analysis, and a lot of other very important documents that will allow S1 and S2 to become real by the end of Q2. So anyway, I would like to thank everyone for your attention tonight. Thank you, Sue, for being with me, reporting to our audience. The next time for our podcast is going to be around our March meeting. Although it's virtual, that podcast will continue. Thank you all.
For the latest developments from either the International Sustainability Standards Board or the International Accounting Standards Board, make sure to subscribe on the IFRS Foundation website, www.ifrs.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take some time to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast player.